It became clear that there was a pattern of attacks on elderly people within the South East London area.
To rape them and sexually assault them, hideous crimes.
Operation Minstead had gone on years and became a subject of derision as far as the police were concerned.
The fact that it's elderly people in the kind of the autumn of their lives and something like this happens to them, I can't imagine any of them ever came anywhere near recovering from it.
I knew I had to do everything I could to bring that to an end.
It was a crime of almost breathtaking callousness.
The man who tried to kill her will never be free to harm
The
again.
audio was too graphic to be broadcast.
May provide some closure for the victim's family, targeted young women unable to defend themselves.
Colin Sutton was a detective chief inspector and senior investigating officer in the Metropolitan Police. He led the investigations into some of the most complex and high-profile cases ever, bringing dangerous criminals to justice.
He showed his character.
Then heard screaming. The Night Stalker pulls out the gun. Another 146 victims.
In this series, he will take you inside those cases and show you how he caught these criminals using nothing but pure detective work. This is The Real Manhunter.
Now been found guilty on all 29 of those charges. The oldest victim, 89.
The officer in charge described it as a senseless
The life
tragedy.
sentence may provide some closure for his victims' families.
I'm afraid I'm enraged, I'm bleeding badly. Can you please get some help for me?
If you're bleeding badly, did you just say? I'll call the ambulance, the police straight away.
Emergency Richard.
Ambulance, please.
Thank you.
The police and the ambulance are on their way. You okay?
He's been all around the bungalow. He got into my bedroom, he tried to smother me.
It became clear we were dealing with an evil human being, a ruthless individual.
A lot of his victims suffered at his hands, but suffered in silence and never actually reported them, but carried it with them to their graves.
The Night Stalker was a clever and sophisticated criminal. There's no doubt of that. He thought about what he was doing. He thought about how he might get caught, and he thought of ways to avoid getting caught. For 17 years, this man had struck fear into a community, and that couldn't continue. I knew I had to do everything I could to bring that to an end.
An investigation is underway following a burglary and sexual assault in the Shirley area of Croydon last night. The victim, an elderly woman in her 80s, was woken by an intruder who had broken into her home. Police have yet to confirm if it is linked to a series of attacks by a man known as the Night Stalker.
During the 1990s, there was a pattern of attacks on elderly people within the South East London area. Speculation, could one person be responsible, who by then been given the nickname Night Stalker.
This had been running for 17 years and there didn't seem to be any answers as to who this man was.
At that particular period in South East London, there were thousands of elderly people living in fear of this criminal. He had an air of invincibility about him.
The numbers were large. Mainly they were incidents where a prowler had broken in at night, woken up the occupants, who were always elderly, occasionally indecently assaulted them, but not always indecently assaulted them. And on several occasions he'd raped them.
You couldn't serve as either a uniform or a detective in South East London and not know about Operation Minstead. I was promoted from Detective Sergeant to Detective Inspector in January 2009. I was selected to join Operation Minstead, and I'd been there about 3 months, and Colin appeared early summer of 2009. Up until Colin arriving, I was kind of the only manager on the ground, so to have for Colin to come as SIO was a relief to me.
In April 2009, I was still the leader of my murder team at Putney. The new commander of the Homicide and Serious Crime Command left a message for me saying, could I go up and see him at Scotland Yard just to have a chat, and then asked me what I knew about Operation Minstead. I just knew that Operation Minstead was South East London, that it was a long-running investigation into a series of rapes and burglaries of old people. My team had been successful in other cases, high-profile cases, and just wanted somebody to have a look at it. This is Lewisham Police Station, where Operation Minstead was based. I'd never been here before. I was asked to come over and have a look and see if I could come up with any ideas. This is where it was based, so I came. But I met the team and realised how small it was and how difficult their task was in trying to catch this guy that had been committing these terrible offences for so long. It was a case that seriously needed solving. I was pleased to have the opportunity to try and contribute to that. When I first came here to take a look, I knew very little about the case, and I was brought up to speed by going to a meeting of all the supervisors. We sat down and they were discussing the lines of inquiry and what was going on, and I made a few notes.
The first one was the suspect's description. That was based on victim statements and victim accounts. It was very, very generic, but it was allegedly a black male, light-skinned to dark-skinned, normally dressed in dark clothing from head to foot. The age range varied from 30s to upper 40s, quite well built, average height, and normally wearing a balaclava or some type of face covering. And then there was obviously the offender's DNA, which at that stage had been left at various scenes, so we were using that to eliminate people in a mass DNA screening. One of our victims had said that when the perpetrator had woken her up, he was dressed in dark clothing, potentially could have been wearing a motorcycle helmet and motorcycle clothing, and then when he left, she thought she heard the engine of a motorcycle. So on that basis, the line of inquiry was started to trace motorcycle licence holders in that area. It was a very large line of inquiry, and it essentially was suspended pretty soon into my tenure.
Where you've got lots of cases going back over many years, there's no substitute for just locking yourself away to get a feel of what they're about and what was happening. So for the first kind of couple of weeks, I was a sponge. I was soaking up the information rather than sort of processing it and thinking about it and looking at what it might mean and where we could go.
I got on very well with Colin. He was an established SIO with a good reputation on the command. I was a brand new detective inspector, kind of finding my feet. I knew about investigation, I knew about homicide investigations, and obviously this type of investigation as well. Colin had an advantage in that he could brief upwards with the management team of the Homicide Command. He brought elements to the investigation that I couldn't bring to it, and obviously another perspective.
What became clear is that these offences were confined to a pretty exact geographical area. If you took that part of Greater London, south of the River Thames, and to the east of the A23 in Croydon, that was his hunting ground. So it's like a quarter of Greater London. And there were one or two offences just over the border into Surrey. Mostly it was kind of outer southeast London. What came to be regarded as offence number 1 in the Minstead series took place in Wickham Road in Shirley in October 1992. The police got a message that there'd been a burglary at a bungalow where an 84-year-old woman lived on her own. And when the police turned up and responded to this call, that was when the victim confided in them that not only had she been burgled and had property stolen, but that she'd also been raped. Now, most burglars run a mile if there's somebody in the house. They want to burgle a house that's empty. But in this case, there was interaction between the burglar and the victim. It was late in the evening on the 12th of October 1992. A man in a balaclava broke in, went down the side of this house here, removed a pane of glass from the window. He'd removed it whole, he hadn't smashed it, he'd kind of peeled away the fitting and taken out the pane of glass and set it down quite sort of carefully, and gone in through the window. At some point during his progress through the house, he'd been removing light bulbs from their fittings, presumably so that if the victim woke up and tried to switch the light on, that there would be no light. He also cut the telephone wires, because when the ordeal was over and the victim went to try and phone for help, she found that her phone had been disconnected. He went into her bedroom, and this 84-year-old lady was confronted with the horror of being awoken in her own bed by a figure looming over her with a torch, a dark figure, hand over her mouth telling her not to make a noise. And her ordeal went on for something like 2 hours, and during that time the intruder raped her before stealing some jewellery and £250 in cash. A terrible crime, a terrible ordeal for an old lady to have to go through in her own home. You can only imagine how terrifying it must have been for her in the dark, in that house, on her own. She should feel safe there, it's her own home, and she's got this intruder doing these terrible things to her. He eventually leaves her after 2 hours, and she wants to raise the alarm and finds that her phone's been cut off. She can't phone anybody. So she walks along to where her niece lives nearby, and she asks her niece to raise the alarm, and police are told that there's been a burglary. There's just been an overnight burglary, and they turn out, attend the burglary, and it's at that point that the lady reveals that she's been raped. She's been raped in her own home in the middle of the night by this intruder.
Once he'd overpowered his victim, he used to spend considerable time in the address, either going around himself or speaking to the actual victim themselves. And he showed caring attributes, which is very unusual for an offender.
The victim told them that the rapist had kissed her on the lips and on the cheek. It had the investigators a little bit sort of confused and bemused. Is he trying to kind of make things right and to smooth things over and maintain a good relationship with them, or is he trying to persuade them that they shouldn't tell the police and, you know, they shouldn't come after him?
Almost more disturbing and confusing for the victims, who were probably not able to think straight, having just been the victim of such a horrible crime.
It's just this really unusual way in which he treated the victim almost with sensitivity and a degree of compassion, having just inflicted the most barbaric of acts and assaults on her. There really is no other way to investigate an allegation of rape but to subject the victim again to another intrusive and, you know, uncomfortable experience of being medically examined and forensic swabs being taken. Because if you haven't got the evidence that you get from that examination, those swabs, you're never going to prove the case further down the line anyway. So she's taken to the suite, and she's examined, and swabs are taken. And from those swabs, and particularly from her clothing, from her pyjamas and some of the bedding here, there was semen, and it was from that semen that a full male DNA profile was later distilled. In 1992, the use of DNA as an investigative tool was kind of in its infancy. The database was very small, so although there was semen present from the rape and on both the swabs and the old lady's pyjamas, it wasn't until some years later that those objects were resubmitted to the laboratory and yielded a male DNA profile. At first, the police weren't aware that, you know, this was going to be part of a series. Obviously, there had been no other similar offences in the recent past, and this was thought really to be very much for a one-off. The investigation stayed with the local borough. It's their task for the local CID to investigate it, and so it stayed there. And they did investigate it, and they got nowhere and didn't find a suspect, and it was kind of filed as unsolved. As time went on, we realised that this was a series and that these sort of houses and this type of 1930s semi-detached houses or bungalows in these essentially quiet and residential parts of southeast London were the hunting ground for the Night Stalker. Six years later, in September 1998, there was a significant attack just outside the Met Police area in Warlingham in Surrey. It's important in the story of the Night Stalker because it was in Warlingham, in this road, that the second offence took place where the suspect left DNA. The 81-year-old victim was in bed, lived alone, she had mobility problems, and the suspect came along, entered through that gate down the side of the house, and he had a large screwdriver, and he tried to prise a window open. And then he realised that there was actually a key hanging on a string on the fence near the back door. And the victim had left that for her carers and her family to let themselves in if they needed to. So he used that, why bother with the screwdriver when I've got the key? But those actions of trying to break in with the screwdriver became very important because every tool like this, every screwdriver has a unique shape. Microscopically, the marks that screwdriver makes are different to other screwdrivers. And what happens is the scenes of crime officers will take a plaster cast from the mark that leaves, and that can then be microscopically photographed and examined. And when there are other marks at other crime scenes, they can be compared. And the comparison of those marks can link two crime scenes in very much the same way as a DNA profile or a fingerprint might link them. He was in the premises for some time, and he did make an attempt to rape the victim, but it wasn't successful. He asks her for money, and she said she didn't have any. And he then climbs on top of her, and he begins to indecently assault her. He tries to pull her legs apart. He's going to rape her. He undid his trousers. But she yells out in pain from her chronic arthritis as he tries to move her legs. And then she almost feigns illness, feigns that she's passed out. And this seemed to concern him, and he stopped. In fact, he had so much concern for her, it seems, he then tried to find a pulse to make sure she was still alive and picked up her wrists and looked at that. And he left. The ordeal for her was over quite quickly. There was a genuine fear of a reprisal. In this case, the fear was more that the intruder would return. And so it wasn't until the following morning when she spoke to her son that she reported the offence. He wasn't able to perform the act, but in doing so, he did ejaculate. And there was semen found on the carpet in her bedroom. From that semen, a full male DNA profile was extracted, and it matched exactly the profile from the 1992 offence. Now we had two rapes by the same unknown person. We had a series, we had Operation Minstead.
This then enlightened them to the prospect that they were dealing with a serial rapist, a serial sex offender targeting elderly people. It wasn't long before this started filtering out to the media, and reports of sexual offences began being attributed to someone who we called the Night Stalker.
Night Stalker was something that was invented by the press. People running the investigation in the early 2000s were not particularly happy with, because it was felt that it accentuated the fear that these people should be in.
The police didn't particularly like that phrase being used, but it was easy for us to describe to the public that this was someone who was breaking in at night time.
Part of the strategy very much was to try not to have elderly ladies in southeast London having to live their lives in fear. If you look at the media reporting of Operation Minstead throughout its history, the focus is always on the sexual element of the crimes. And what this does, or what this did, was to, I think, focus the methods of investigation that were used onto those which are used for rape and sexual offences. And very much that became DNA. team was concentrating their efforts on trying to get DNA swabs from suspects. Compare that with the DNA that they had from the first 2 crime scenes. I'm pretty sure that those on that team in 1998 would have thought that it would be quite a quick job. They just needed to find this guy, and his DNA will put on the database. Once that DNA's there, it matches up, game over, job done. Sadly, that's not what happened.
The DNA in itself ultimately proved to be fruitless.
They were trying to get scientists to do really difficult things. The 2 main scientific pieces of work that went on were around physical characteristics of the DNA profile and ancestry. The profile showed this man was black by ethnicity, but that his skin was likely to be pale, freckled, and that his hair would be ginger or very light. The ancestry said that our suspect was likely to have come from the Lesser Antilles and most likely Trinidad and Tobago. What that caused the investigation team to do was to take the publicity campaign about Operation Minstead to Trinidad in case somebody over there recognised the person it might be.
They wanted to go for a little swim after work. A photographer from a Sunday newspaper was on hand to catch them in their Speedos lying around the pool. A rather unfortunate interpretation was put on that.
They could have been a little more circumspect in what they did. It resulted in an article in one of the newspapers where they're called the Frying Squad. It just kind of debased the sort of gravity of the situation and of the investigation. And ultimately it was something that didn't take the investigation 1 millimetre further.
When I arrived in January 2009, a very large mass DNA screening exercise had been in operation for about 11 years. Certainly it involved officers going to the home addresses of people that we'd identified that might fit the description of the suspect and essentially persuading them to give an elimination swab. And then obviously that would then be sent to the Forensic Science Service.
And because of the age range that was being looked at, these were black men who'd grown up in southeast London during the late 1970s and the 1980s. And during that time, I think that their contacts with the Metropolitan Police may not necessarily have been positive. You're then going round and saying, can I have a sample of your DNA that we can compare with our crime scene? And no matter how many promises are made that that sample will be destroyed if it's not you, the mistrust that built up over a couple of decades was still there. And it meant that cooperation was rarely given, in truth.
We'd eliminated 2,000 people, and we had another 2,000 to do, so that would have taken another 11 years.
When I first went over there, it just so happened that week they had had 1 man who had offered up his swab for DNA, which meant that the whole operation to try to find the Night Stalker by DNA swabbing was going to be fraught with difficulties. And I wrote in the margin of my book at that first meeting, a couple of days into my review, what if we didn't have DNA?
The Night Stalker operated over a very large area of London, in the southeast, South London and Surrey. A total of about 2.5 million people.
Again, this is a typical road right in the middle of his favourite hunting grounds. And you can see there 1930s houses and bungalows, semis. You can still point out houses that show there's no person that lives there. The house hasn't been modernised, the garden is kept in a way and hasn't been changed into a driveway. And that was what he based his crime upon. Your typical Minstead victim had their windows done in the 80s. They were replaced with UPVC windows with external beading. And he knew that, and so a lot of his victims had the same sort of window that he was very expert at breaking in through. And that was because he had external beading. He could rip out, take the pane of glass out, and he was in. He would start his surveillance, his sort of reconnaissance, days before he committed the offence, but then he would often sit there for hours at a time looking to see what was going on and to make sure he understood what the habits were in that particular address.
It adds another more sinister dimension that he spent so long researching his victims, watching the premises and seeing who was coming and going, what their behaviour patterns were, and just planning how he was going to conduct his next attack.
The occupier went to bed, and he could tell that by the lights moving from downstairs to upstairs and then going out. He would look to make sure there was only one person living there, because by and large he wanted to attack premises where somebody lived on their own. One of the first things I had to do when I went over to look and do the sort of review on Operation Minstead was to get up to speed with the old cases. The most troubling of those at that time was the case in 1999 of an 88-year-old woman who lived on her own in a bungalow in Orpington. At 3 in the morning, she's awoken by sensing that there's somebody in her bedroom, and she looks up through the gloom and sees that there's this man standing at the foot of her bed. He put a gloved hand over her mouth and said, "I want your money." And she sort of muttered something, and he took his hand away, and she said, "Look, there's no money here in the bedroom. If you want me to give you my money, you'll have to get me up and take me to my living room." And so he sort of pulled her up off of the bed, ushered her through to the living room, where she found her purse in a handbag, and she gave him the purse, and he emptied the contents of the purse into his pockets. He pulled her up from a chair that she'd been sitting in, placed her on the edge of the sofa, pulled up her nightdress and raped her several times, and left her battered, bleeding, in such a state that when she was able to raise the alarm by pressing her care link panic button, police attended and called an ambulance straight away, and she was taken straight to hospital. She required emergency surgery. It's the closest that the Night Stalker ever came to killing somebody there and then. Had she not had medical help, she would have died, would have bled to death. She never went back to her bungalow where she'd been for 25 years. She was discharged from hospital in sheltered accommodation. And although the physical injuries had healed up, the psychological injuries never did. And she took that night of terror and pain to the grave with her.
She was very wary, very frightened, really. You see, it ruined her life in a way, didn't it? There she was, living in her own home, and suddenly the world fell apart. She always used to say she hoped he would be caught before she died. She had these terrible nightmares, so she dreaded the night. She dreaded going to bed and going to sleep.
Well, it'd be very difficult for me as a 56-year-old male to understand what an elderly victim would go through in these circumstances. These are people in the twilight of their years. It must have been absolutely terrifying for them. And in relation to that, they were staying awake during the night because they didn't want to become one of his victims, and they were sleeping during the day.
We saw it time and again with the victims. There's this sort of stoicism. It's the spirit of the Blitz or something like that. It's kind of because it was that generation. And that's why they tried, in some ways, to block it out.
They weren't complainers. They didn't like speaking to the police about what happened to them.
And we agreed that if the victims of the Night Stalker had been aged between 18 and 36 rather than 58 and 96, there would have been much more publicity, and that for some reason the aged victims were not as newsworthy.
You can't name victims of sexual assaults, and while that's quite right and quite understandable, it meant that the suffering that they endured was somehow anonymised, and the impact of his crimes I don't think was truly appreciated.
I have no doubt if it hadn't been that particular generation that had been targeted, more resources would have had to be brought to bear.
In May 2009, I finally got my chance to see one of these crime scenes for myself. I'd immerse myself reading all this detail about all these crimes going back. It was down in Croydon in a road called Princes Avenue. For me, it was interesting not just to see what an offence looked like, but to see how the team were responding to it. This bungalow was the scene of the first Minstead Night Stalker offence that I went to in person after I started to go over there to do my review. There was a 78-year-old lady lived here on her own. When we came to do our investigation, we found that he'd gained entrance by that gate at the side to the rear garden. He'd actually been into another garden of a neighbour and borrowed a pitchfork from their shed and used that to force the window open at this bungalow. She goes to bed 9 p.m. She's a frail woman, she needs a frame to walk with. She's awoken 4 o'clock in the morning by this, to her, huge man sitting astride her on her bed. It's dark, he's holding her down. At some point when the Night Stalker is on top of her, he starts caressing her. He asks her, quite politely, "Would you like more?" And she equally politely declines and said, "No, thank you." It's another one of these cases where he has shown a degree of concern or care for the victim. She needed to go to the toilet, so she asked him if he would go and fetch her walking frame, and he does. And she'd also tried to find an emergency pendant on the bedside table, but she didn't know. The intruder had seen it first and hidden it from her. He's asked her about things in the house. He's rummaged through all her drawers. And he's a bit frustrated because he can't find any money. The ordeal this lady suffered was only about half an hour in length. Managed to find £20 or so in coins and cash. That was all that she lost. Once he'd gone, she locked the back door again to kind of make sure he wasn't going to come back and went to sleep. But it wasn't until after she woke up at 9 o'clock that she used landline in the premises to raise the alarm. When I arrived here, I saw what there was of the Minstead team. Very busy, knocking on houses, doing door-to-door inquiries, looking for CCTV, looking for any kind of clues, evidence they might find in the locality, just like they would do if it were a murder investigation. So I suppose, although it was the very first one I came out to, really this was the sort of seed for my thinking that this comprehensive investigation of every single case was just too resource intensive. We were getting 2, sometimes 3 a night when he was busy. You just cannot keep doing this kind of ultimate model of investigation that you use for homicides. I still think that may have been counterproductive to finding a strategy that would actually take him down.
Colin came in, and by thinking outside the box, by taking a fresh approach, he decided that this was someone that needed to be looked at as a burglar rather than a sex offender.
Up until then, we'd only been looking at offences involving a sexual assault or very high Minstead indicator. So what we decided was to kind of target every single burglary that overnight on elderly people in South East London.
In that time period, there would have been many more offences where there was no forensic link, which had been carried out by the Night Stalker and which the police were totally oblivious to and unaware of.
I'd got my intelligence team to give me a printout of what could have been Minstead offences, and that was where you got to about 100 offences.
We decided to just target our resources where we could get things really quickly, and all aimed at identifying the offender, not proving that he committed the offence.
All the evidence needed to put him in prison for a very long time had already been preserved. We didn't need to prove that he was committing these new offences. We didn't need to get every available scrap of evidence from these new offences. We could treat them as intelligence opportunities. In other words, we can look at them to try and find the features of the offence which might help us identify him. I had a view that if we were to use crime pattern analysis and sort of analytical minds to try to predict what was happening and to understand where this man was offending, then we needed to have all the information possible.
This change in the thrust of the investigation that gave birth to what was called Minstead Light.
I was desperate to prove that Minstead was throwing away offences and intelligence opportunities by leaving crimes to be looked at and investigated by the borough. And I thought I was going to have to go through years and years of crime reports to prove this, but such a case fell into my lap.
By May 2009, the investigative strategy of Minstead Light was being written, but it hadn't officially come into play. During that time, there was an overnight burglary in Farnaby Road. It's not an offence that we would normally have taken on an investigation, but we applied the Minstead Light principles and went down there to use it as a test case.
The house was occupied by an elderly lady and her son, who himself was in his 60s, so it was given back to the borough to investigate. He'd broken in, and he'd clearly broken in a normal sort of way at the rear with a pane of glass, and moved things around inside the house, but hadn't actually stolen anything. He wasn't there for very long, and decided for whatever reason that he was going to abort and leave, and he did. When the borough CID were investigating the crime, the son of the victim told them that there was a carton of orange juice in the kitchen, which seemed to have lessened in volume overnight, as if somebody had drunk for it. He knew he hadn't, his mother hadn't. And the scenes of crime officer from the borough, doing the right thing, swabbed the mouth of the carton, submitted it for DNA analysis, and very quickly afterwards was presented with a full male DNA profile which matched the other Minstead crime scenes.
We hadn't had a DNA hit for about 4 years at that stage, so it was significant that we knew it was the Night Stalker, and what that meant was we could draw on further resource. It also gave us a very, very good break in that we had some CCTV from a nearby house, and that was pretty much one of the first occasions in the length of the inquiry where we were certain that it was the actual Night Stalker.
We had the time that the intruder left the house because the son, the victim, told us. We went to this CCTV and we saw the bottom half of the Night Stalker walking that way. What we then did was look back on the same CCTV because we thought if he's walking that way, he must have walked the other way to get there. And he had, but what shocked us was how long before. It's like 3 hours before.
He'd obviously been at that scene for a significant amount of time and felt confident enough to not only be in the vicinity of the Farnaby Road address for 3 hours, but he'd obviously done a burglary 2 or 3 doors down and one round the corner on the same evening. Very confident that he wouldn't be caught.
And since he'd only spent around about half an hour at the most in this house, we know that he spent in excess of 2.5 hours sitting in that back garden, watching the house, waiting for the lights to go out, waiting for his time to strike and to break in. And you can just imagine kind of he's sitting watching the windows, and what he's waiting for is for all those lights to go out. You know, the downstairs ones go out, maybe the top floor ones come on and then go out, and then makes his move. Somehow that seemed really quite sinister to us, the thought of this man sort of sitting unseen in the dark in a garden, watching people in their own home. The investigation had to change direction. We had to change tactics, we had to get one step ahead of him. The only way we were going to catch him was if we were to catch him in the act.
And that's why we had to become a night duty burglary squad and get out at night time.
Had the police carried on the way they were before Colin arrived, Night Stalker would never have been caught. It's as simple as that.
We were dealing with an evil human being, a ruthless individual. 2 things were certain. The Night Stalker would strike again. That couldn't continue. I had to do everything I could to bring that to an end. A large part of being a leader of any team is to make sure that those on the team below you are operating to the best of their ability, and that will mean making sure they're doing the things they're good at and you're giving the right tasks to the right people. The proposal to go to Minstead Light was surprisingly well received. It depends on the situation whether you're going to encounter resistance or not. If you're going in raking over somebody else's work and you tell them that you think they're not doing it properly and they should be doing it a different way, then that's something that's quite inflammatory. Nobody likes to be in that position. I think at this stage in Operation Minstead, everybody was just accepting of the fact that we weren't coping, and if it carried on in the way that it was going to fall over. I think in terms of the team, they saw it as a great sort of release for them, because they were struggling under the burden of trying to do this high-level, complete investigation for every single one of these crimes that was being reported. Each morning when I went in, there was kind of two streams of information which might be able to tell me that there'd been an incident overnight which was worthy of our attention. The intelligence team on Operation Minstead had a search which ran overnight, every night or early in the morning, to see reported crimes, not just in London actually, but in the whole sort of home counties, to see if there were any crimes that fitted our criteria so they could flag them up. And then on top of that, you had the great awareness that there was within the Metropolitan Police, particularly in South East London, as to the possibility of Minstead cases.
There was an offence in 2009 that chimed with the team. It really struck a chord with the team about how vulnerable these elderly people were.
There was a report of a burglary on a 93-year-old lady. It was in his favourite hunting ground, and given that the age of the victim and interaction between the victim and the burglar, it was clearly going to be something for Minstead to look at. When I heard about this case, I thought, well, if she's very frail and she's that old, there are dangers here, so I'm going to go down and just make sure that we actually do everything that we need to do in case she takes a turn for the worse. So I went down to Shirley, where she lived. She lived in a large detached house in prime sort of stockbroker belt country.
And there was an elderly lady there, hadn't said anything to the initial investigating officers from the borough or any of our officers until Colin arrived.
This lady was gradually becoming more and more infirm, and she'd lost the sight in one eye, and her mobility was difficult. I went in, and one of the family liaison officers said to her, "Oh, this is Mr. Sutton, he's the boss, you see." So she said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Sutton." So I said, "Oh, no, you can call me Colin," and tried to sort of talk to her. And she had this lovely sort of cut glass accent almost. She was, a very well-spoken lady, and even in the dire position that she was, she sort of maintained a dignity. When I said hello to her, she extended her hand, and I took it, and it wasn't to shake hands, it was to hold hands. While she was holding my hand, she got her other hand and put it on top, so she was sort of hanging onto my hand with both hands. And she pulled me into water and almost whispered to me, "He interfered with me, you know." And I realised in that second that the kind of courage that it had taken her to make that disclosure. She hadn't told the officers that were there before. It's the first time we knew that she'd been indecently assaulted.
She seemed to form a bond with Colin quite quickly, and I know that she held his hand and she told him, the first person, that she'd been sexually assaulted by the offender. And that seemed to affect Colin.
I just wanted to cry when she said that to me. I just felt so sorry for her. And I kind of remembered that she was one of scores, 100 or more people that had been through this. It was the first time I'd met a live victim there and then, in her own home.
She only had, I think, one living relative, and she was a daughter who lived in South Africa, and she was unable to return at that time. And this lady, from that day, she essentially stopped eating.
She gave up on living, really. And it was only a matter of weeks and she was dead. And I never saw her again. Her daughter never saw her again. And because of the difficulties with causation, there was never going to be any realistic prospect of charging the Night Stalker with her murder or manslaughter. But he killed her. He killed her just as surely as if he'd stabbed her or shot her. It just took a little bit longer.
You've got an offender here who's breaking into homes in the middle of the night. waking up his victims by shining a torch into their eyes, sexually assaulting them. It's not just terrifying for the elderly, it's also terrifying for the families of the elderly who'd be concerned about their mothers.
There's really often a balance to be struck in terms of publicity about it, because you've got the idea that you're going to arouse public fear and you're going to make people fear crime more than they ought to, because the chances of it happening to them are quite small, but they'll see it in the newspapers and on the TV and think, I'm going to become a victim. And you have to balance that with the idea that you're going to make people more aware, and that will make them take better precautions. And you've also got the fact, what's the publicity going to do in terms of the offender? It could make him go underground, it could make him stop.
And there was a pattern which emerged that he would go off the radar. Perhaps he got nervous.
There was certainly a theory that one of the Minstead appearances on BBC Crime Watch made him stop offending for a long while. 999 call tape was played, and it kind of shamed him into realising what he'd done.
He's ransacked the bungalow and badly lately. What a thing to do to an old lady.
The fact is that if people are determined to break into premises, to a house, any premises, then given enough time and equipment, they probably can. Most of the security that you can equip your house with is about delaying. It's things that will take time, and the hope is that while the person who's trying to break in is spending a lot of time, then they might be seen and somebody will call the police and they might be intercepted. But it is very difficult to make a house completely impregnable to a burglar. Certainly many of the houses that the Night Stalker selected for his victims had very little spent on them.
One offence that I remember quite well is there was an offence on the 6th of June 2009 in Queen Hill Road, which is South Croydon, just off Selsdon High Street.
There was a Saturday afternoon in early June. It was the home of an 82-year-old woman. She was living alone in a semi-detached house. She suffered quite badly from dementia, and she was having real difficulties in expressing to the officers what had happened. While we knew there'd been an intruder and the lady who lived here on her own, she couldn't give us any more details beyond that. So we didn't really know if anything had been stolen, we didn't know if she'd been assaulted, if there was any sexual assault.
It was very regular that he would target people who had dementia. I personally think deliberately, but as you can imagine, a lot of elderly people do have dementia, and it makes it extremely difficult for the police to get information from them to help identify the offender.
At the time, there was an extension being built on this house in the next street. It was like a building site there, effectively, and he was able to get through there. It was insecure, into the back garden of this house, and it's from there that he removed the pane of glass and broke it. It was roughly on this spot here that Nathan Easton, my DI, and I had a conversation. We had officers all around this street investigating this break-in, and we didn't really know what had happened because the victim couldn't tell us. They were weary. They'd been responding to 2 or 3 offences a night for most of that week, and we were just chasing shadows. And almost simultaneously, Nathan and I said, we can't keep doing this.
His offending had increased massively. We had it's a large area of South East London. 2 million people live in that area, but we knew the areas that he favoured, and I felt that, and as did everybody else on the team, that if we had enough resources, we'd be able to target the areas that he liked to offend in the most.
I'd had these sort of half ideas that really some sort of proactive operation was going to have to be the answer, but I also knew that I'd need a lot of support both from those on the team below me and indeed a lot of support from those above me if we were going to do it properly. Everything that the operation had been doing for most of its 17 years was focused on DNA. And the major plank of what they were trying to achieve was to take swabs from as many people on the list as possible until they took the swab from the right man and everything would be fine. I took the view that wasn't going to happen, so we had to do something else. And that something else didn't involve doing an investigation of offences after they'd happened, because quite frankly we'd been doing that for years and it hadn't worked. We needed something new, we needed a different approach. That different approach had to be surveillance, waiting for this prolific burglar to come and commit an offence in front of our eyes and catch him in the act. When I went across to Lewisham Police Station to begin my review of Operation Minstead, and I really didn't know anybody at all, Nathan was the first police officer I spoke to on Minstead. He was supremely kind of supportive of me and gave me his backing to everything I was trying to do, really. And I tried to repay that by keeping the pressure from above away from him so that he could get on and do his job and manage the team in the way that he did.
By the kind of end of September, beginning of October 2009, we were planning a very large proactive operation in an attempt to catch the Night Stalker, where we discussed what, the resources that were required, and obviously we had to get approval for that operational plan.
In the past, I've been involved with a burglar when I was a PC at Tottenham. A guy called L. Dobson, who used to take people's louver windows out. And he wasn't sophisticated, and we could just round up, a dozen, 20 people and sit and wait for him to commit the crime in front of us. The principle was the same, what we were trying to do with the Night Stalker, but he was so much cleverer, he was so much more cunning, and he was doing it over such a big area that we needed to have our tactics and our resources refined in the same way if we were going to match him. I knew that if I was going to do this surveillance operation in the way I wanted, I needed some help from all across the Met. So what I did was I booked a meeting room at Scotland Yard to see some people of equivalent rank to me. I sent out an email to a dozen or so of them to say, can you come to a meeting at Scotland Yard? When I get there, there's actually probably twice that number of people. And I think that was really encouraging because certainly my view from the time I'd been there, I sensed actually Minstead was a little bit of a backwater that people got sort of shoved into and nobody really cared about.
We went to the meeting. Colin was able to persuade them that the plan looked like a good one. We were essentially pushing against an open door in relation to the senior echelons of the Metropolitan Police Service. It was just a case of, did we have the right plan with the resources that we wanted?
I presented it without a PowerPoint presentation or handouts or graphs or whatever. I just kind of said, this is happening now. We're in the midst of the most prolific spell of Minstead Man's activity in 17 years. I've had a 93-year-old tell me that he interfered with her. I've got an 88-year-old lady who's going for an HIV test. We need to stop him.
What it took was guts, because you are talking about putting huge amounts of resources onto the streets, and the cost of that would be astronomical.
Part of the operational plan was to have surveillance teams and observation points in areas where the Night Stalker was active.
The first step on the road to the surveillance operation really was to work out where we were going to do it.
Colin wanted to draw up an area which could feasibly be watched by a dragnet operation.
Initially, when the intelligence analysts started looking at this, produced the very first map, and it was huge, and so we had to refine it.
So we went back to the drawing board and we found another area still in that Shirley cluster, but a smaller area. Even so, something like 1 in every 6 Minstead offences took place in the area, and that was a smaller area we were able to control with, we thought, around about 70 officers. So that was the plan which was hatched, and that was the plan that I took to the Force Tasking Group.
As a result of that meeting, a call went out across the Met to all the murder teams asking for DCs to go over and work on the case, and I volunteered to go. So it was a case I wanted to get involved in.
It had the backing of the Commissioner, Paul Stevenson, at the time, and it had the backing of the senior management team at the Met. However, if it resulted in no one being found and a huge bill for overtime being submitted, then there was only one person that was going to get the blame, and that would have been Colin.
When the proactive operation began, 28th of October, it was ran from a very large control room up in Vauxhall, and it's called Central 3000.
It's an absolute sort of state-of-the-art facility that is primarily used for very serious things like terrorist or kidnap incidents. It's essentially a large room with lots of sort of desk consoles with computers and telephones and radio channels on them. And along one wall is a bank of, I think it's 18 screens.
There was surveillance control, There was the operational control, which either myself or Colin were running, and there were other officers monitoring assets in the control room. So there's probably about 16 to 20 people in the control room at any one time. You had a very large number of officers out on the streets, and we had Minstead officers that were going to monitoring addresses where we had alarms in.
Everybody was static, tucked away in a place where anybody walking or driving through the area would just have no chance of seeing them. And to back that up, apart from we had some air support as well, but we had a mobile surveillance team that was situated outside the area that we were surveilling. The reason for that was that if we stopped 4 people during the course of the investigation who weren't the Night Stalker, that the word would get on the sort of grapevine, the police are doing a big operation there, and it would effectively blow the surveillance. It would be no good anymore.
The night shift would start with a briefing at Lewisham Police Station, and there'd be about 70 officers, including the surveillance teams. We'd be given an update on the case.
Either myself or Colin would brief on what was expected of them, what their roles were, what to do in the event of anything happening.
I was allocated the role of being in a mobile unit in a car. I was with 2 other officers in the area but out of sight, and to be in radio contact with the rest of the team.
And then they would be sent to their operational areas with the right communication and the right assets and resources.
And then everybody goes down to Shirley. They're in their OPs by 11 p.m. I'm at Central 3000 with the inside team there, waiting for this prolific burglar to come and commit an offence in front of our eyes.
Then, you know, the time came, started to get light, and we thought, well, he's never going to come.
And nothing happens, essentially. Very little moves all night. 1 or 2 vehicles pass by, no pedestrians, and we all go home. First night of surveillance passed through, we thought, without any incident. Nothing happened. It wasn't until I got back into Lewisham the next morning that I found out that overnight there had been 3 burglaries which we thought were almost certainly Night Stalker jobs.
And those offences had happened just outside the boundary of our surveillance operation.
The first 2 were in this road here. The first of those was an attempt where he failed for once to get the glass out and didn't manage to get in. So he tried again at another house just down the road. Now, the annoying thing about this is that this location here is literally 100 yards north of where our surveillance area started. He was that close to us on the very first night, and we've missed him. But there was more to it than that, because the 3rd burglary took place about a mile in that direction, just down by the Royal Bethlehem Hospital. The only way that the Night Stalker could have got from this burglary here to the 3rd one down there was right through the plot where we were doing our surveillance. It was obvious a vehicle must have been used. You couldn't walk from the 2nd to the 3rd burglary. And when you looked at the map, the only logical way to drive that journey would be straight down our plot. There was a school which had CCTV on Orchard Way, and there were a couple of frames that showed a vehicle going past at about the right time. And although it was a very grainy shot and it just showed the top of the car, we were able to show that to the experts, and they were able to identify it was a Vauxhall Zafira, and what sort of model and the colour. They also found a man who used to work for the Metropolitan Police, actually, and he lived on Orchard Way, and he had his own CCTV on his own cars on the drive. There was enough to show a car parking up adjacent to where somebody would have gone to commit the 3rd burglary. And even at one point, his footage showed somebody walking around the car. All of a sudden, we knew what sort of car, what make and model and colour was driven by the Night Stalker. And that appeared a huge step forward. But I had to kind of temper the optimism, because I'd been there before in other cases, and just knowing a make, model and colour of a car is a start, but it can mean a whole load of work beyond that to try and find that one car and to use it evidentially. And what I did know was that if we were going to do that, we wouldn't have time to do the surveillance. It was a kind of either or. The resources either had to be on finding the car or doing the surveillance.
Having worked with Colin, I knew him and trusted him, and had faith in what he was doing and could understand the logic behind his thought process, and wanted it to work and believed it would work. And, you know, that kept the whole thing going.
We're doing surveillance, that's our main choice.
Part of the investigation that took place when I first joined the team was that the Night Stalker was stealing victims' cash point cards and then going to a nearby cash point and using the card to withdraw money.
When he started in 1992, almost all pensioners got their state pension with a book at the post office in cash.
But then obviously, you know, technology came along and people had bank cards to prevent cash being stolen.
What he did was he started taking their debit cards, and most of them were so frightened, terrorised by him, that they gave him the PIN numbers.
After he'd committed his rapes, he then went to their bank and withdrew money.
One of the areas we targeted for the main surveillance operation in October was a cash point in Honor Oak, which was attached to an off licence. The relevance of that is that in 2007, the Night Stalker had used that cash point with victims' credit cards to get money out of their accounts. We were pretty certain it was him, but there was no detail that they weren't able to assist us.
It was such disappointment. He'd obviously wanted to keep himself just as secure from any cameras around the cash point as he did when he went in to commit the offences.
As the 2009 proactive operation began to gather pace, we decided to get some better quality cameras fitted in that area around that cash point in Honor Oak. As a result of that, we got some really good images of the Night Stalker when he came from 2 addresses with a victim's credit card and attempted to withdraw cash. Unfortunately, we didn't see his face, but there's some excellent detail in the clothing, his height and build, which gave us really good intelligence.
A couple of nights after this, there is another attempt to use a stolen debit card at a cash machine. The cash machine this time was at a branch of the HSBC Bank that was then on the corner of Westbourne Road. The local police had been round with kind of public appeal posters about Operation Minstead, with an e-fit on of Minstead Man. And the bank, being public-spirited, had put one of these posters in their window, and the poster in the window was literally 3 feet away from the cash machine. So you've got Minstead Man standing there trying to steal money from one of his victims' accounts, and just there by his head is an e-fit of him staring at himself.
And as it turned out, previously he didn't need to have worried because he looked nothing like the e-fit. That's all I'm going to say about that.
That first night was, for all intents and purposes, really quiet for all of us involved in the investigation.
When we went in for the second night of surveillance, it occurred to us that the reason we hadn't been aware of these offences going on the night before was that we weren't monitoring the CAD messages live.
CAD is shorthand for computer-aided dispatch. Essentially, it's electronic messages that get passed between police stations and police operational units and from the centre, which is New Scotland Yard. On the second night of the main proactive operation, there was an interesting development.
We picked up a CAD from Lambeth, and what had taken place was that a woman had been in bed when she heard what she thought was somebody going through her side gate. She was certain somebody was trying to break into her house. She dialed 999. The call was dealt with the kind of seriousness and priority that it should have been. Uniform officers were dispatched to the address. He came into the room, saw her on the phone, took it from her, threw it away, and ran. And he ran down the road as quickly as he could, and a police car came round from the T-junction, and they drove up towards it, and he veered off and went down the side of a house, down sort of an alley, where the car couldn't go, so an officer got out of the car, young officer, fit officer, gave chase.
It was an incredible account. He chased him for nearly 2 miles through streets, parks, rivers, over walls and fences.
And eventually over a wall and into the car park of a mega store, and when the officer came over the wall, he couldn't see where this figure he'd been chasing had gone, and he'd got away. But we were that close, he was that close, we were 10 seconds behind Minstead man at one point.
And I remember one of my colleagues telling, it was incredulous, he just couldn't believe he got away, that by the time he got to the top of the wall, he had disappeared.
But you could hear a pin drop in there. It was a very, very tense moment for the people at the controls, sort of thinking that any second we might actually have him. He might actually be in custody with a police officer. But of course it didn't happen.
From that, we realised that the Night Stalker must be a very fit man who was able to run quickly and for quite a long time.
What could happen? Well, he could just stop. He could just go to ground. He could just give up. He could just say to himself, you've had a good run. You're going to get caught if you keep going. You better stop now. And he might not ever offend again.
Colin wanted to keep it out of the press because he didn't want to risk the suspect going to ground and then us losing the opportunity to actually catch him.
I had a reasonable enough relationship with Colin to ring him up, and he was at pains, great pains, to say, please desist from publishing this story. There was a possibility that it could drive him undercover. Obviously, we weren't to be aware at that point of the huge operation that had been launched by the police to try and find him.
Immediately after the second night, when he was almost caught in Southwark, we then had a 2-week period where it was absolutely quiet, silence, no indications that he was out and about on the streets, no calls, no information whatsoever, and we were concerned that he'd gone to ground, which obviously gave us the indication it was him that was chased.
I was absolutely confident that if we stayed there, eventually he'd come back and he'd commit a crime in front of us. I just couldn't put a time limit on that. I was going to keep my nerve. The team were ready to keep their nerve. It was a question to me as to whether those above me would sanction it to keep going.
I was encouraged by the senior management of the MPS, who essentially held their nerve and stayed with it, but we were very concerned that he could seriously injure or kill somebody. So obviously that was one of the factors that I had to take into account.
And so we kept going, and we kept going, and we kept going, and kept going, and we'd now done 16 nights, and from a personal point of view, it was absolutely fatiguing.
In the 2-week period afterwards, I wasn't available. I was on a course at Hendon, and so Colin was running the operational side up in Central 3000, so he was on his own.
So for 2 weeks, he couldn't help me out with the control room or at Lewisham during the day. So I'm doing the briefing at 9:30 at Lewisham, going in and doing, effectively a night duty until 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, going home for a few hours sleep, back into Lewisham again for 9 for the briefing.
The surveillance went on for a couple of weeks, but despite the time that it was taking, I still had faith in Colin and that the operation was going to be successful. Surveillance work can sometimes be quite boring, really, because for most of the time nothing happens, but you can't afford to take the chance of falling asleep. You've got to be alert and awake. We really, really wanted to get hands on this guy, and we were all behind Colin and supporting his plans, really, to keep it going.
I finished my course on Friday the 13th of November. I realised he was probably exhausted, so I offered to do the weekend and potentially the week after that. So I was up there on the Friday the 13th of the evening.
I said, well, I'm sorted out tonight, but come in on Saturday, do Saturday and Sunday, and I could have 2 days off. That'd be fantastic. That Saturday night, I stayed at home for the first night for, nearly 3 weeks and watched the football, had a glass of wine or whiskey or something, and it was sort of relaxing time and me to catch up on my sleep. We
started at the normal time on the 14th of November, about 11 p.m. And it was a pretty quiet evening from my memory. Nothing particularly exciting happening at any of the cash points in any of the areas. And then in the early hours, we got a call over the radio from one of the officers in one of the observation points.
The Vauxhall Severa was seen nearby old people's type housing from one of the observation points, and that had been put up to the whole team. Soon after that, a man fitting the description of the Night Stalker was seen running from one of these houses.
The suspect running towards a Vauxhall Severa was exceptionally important to us because we'd identified prior to that night that the Night Stalker was using a Type B Vauxhall Severa. So as far as we was concerned, game on.
And he got in the Severa, the lights came on and he drove off. And he drives off up Orchard Way, where there are lots of static observation posts. Now, the plan was not to stop anybody or to arrest anybody here on the plot, because if it was the wrong man, then we'd probably have the details of our surveillance operation leak out.
An officer or two from the OP went to the actual address where he's seen coming from, and the information that I received back in the control room was it looks like that address had been attempted to be forced. You know, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, he's not a resident of this address, so it's likely to be a burglar, hence the Night Stalker.
The Night Stalker was driving quite quickly for some of this. He got up to nearly 60 miles an hour in parts.
I'm convinced, and so are the rest of the team, that he knew he was being followed, and he essentially tried to get away by speeding.
What the surveillance team were able to do was somebody using his local knowledge took a side turning and went on ahead of him to slow him down, which enabled the following surveillance team to catch up. By now we have a convoy of about 4 police vehicles, and one of those vehicles is equipped with covert blue lights and sirens. He couldn't know that when we stopped him, it was because we'd followed him all the way from Shirley. We just wanted him to think it was a random stop in the street, so that if it was the wrong man, then we wouldn't jeopardise the surveillance operation. You can see we're on a reasonably wide and busy sort of main road, and that's fine because we can keep control, but then the Zafira indicates and turns left onto a very different road. The character of the buildings changed. Suddenly we're into a residential street. It's very much the sort of place where the Night Stalker would make his attacks.
So a decision was made to stop him there and then so he couldn't get away, get out of the vehicle and do a runner.
It became an easy decision for Nathan to say, strike now.
It was utter confusion when he gets stopped. I phoned one of the Operation Minstead sergeants and I asked him to find out what was going on, had he been spoken to, who was this man, get some information off him so that we didn't make an unnecessary arrest. The officer asked him a few questions that led him to believe that we had a person who was very likely to be our Night Stalker.
And the officer asked him his name, and he said his name was Colin Grant. The officer said, "OK, have you got any ID on you?" And he said, "No." And they started to have a look, and he could see in the centre console of the car, there were some cards. And he saw the name on there was Delroy Grant.
Some of the clothing from, I think it was in August 2009, that he wore when he approached the cash point with his hood up and gloves on, etc. That clothing was found in his car. Direct link from images we had from the cash point to his arrest.
When they looked in the glove compartment of the car, there was a balaclava-y woolen sort of hat, which fitted with the description given by so many of the Minstead victims after their crimes. When they looked in the boot, there was even more sort of evidence because there was a grey, fleecy top, can of petrol, a pair of shoes, a crowbar, and a big screwdriver.
The Night Stalker was finally stopped and the handcuffs were put on him, and we were able to identify him as Delroy Grant.
Delroy Grant was arrested. About 1:30, my mobile rang and it was Nathan. And he uttered the immortal words, "Hello, Colin, I think we've got him." To which I replied, "Are you joking?" And he said, "Well, would I really ring you up at 1:30 in the morning and joke about something like that?"
As far as I was concerned, the description, the method, the vehicle he was using, some various items that were seen through the vehicle window prior to it being removed, we were pretty certain that he was our man. So we were happy, very happy. No, I didn't feel any guilt that I'd been in the control room when the Night Stalker had been arrested and Colin wasn't. I felt none at all, and it was a butt of many jokes, as you can imagine, for weeks and weeks afterwards, that I'd been on a course, stepped in, and that night he'd been arrested.
But the simple fact was there was no way I was going back to sleep because I was just too sort of excited and wound up by hearing the story of his arrest. So I drove into Lewisham and went into the charge room, and that's when I was introduced to Delroy Grant for the first time, and I finally got my eyes on Minstead man. One of the officers sort of said, "This is Mr. Sutton, he's the boss," and Delroy Grant shook my hand. He extended his hand, shook hands, bowed his head. A bit of a surprise that he was so polite and so sort of deferential. I've never had somebody who was so willing to strike up an irrelevant conversation and to kind of prolong it as he was. It was a window to me to the kind of Delroy Grant that people were going to tell us about over the coming weeks.
What struck me was how fit he was for a man of his age, and then all the scenes I'd been to, some of the windows that he managed to enter, and I remember standing there with Colin saying, how did somebody get into that window? And it all started to come together, how wiry, muscular, and how flexible he was, and that just gave me even more reason to believe that we got the right person.
But they booked him in and they took his clothing from him and bagged it in case it was evidential. And there's a very obscure provision in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act whereby interviews can be conducted with people if there is a life at risk, without solicitors and rights. And the officer said to him, "Look, have you been anywhere? Is there an old lady lying somewhere with injuries who needs medical assistance because you've been there tonight?" He was quite sort of chilling in his reply, really. He said, "I've not visited anybody tonight." That was his reply. "I have not visited anybody tonight." When he was asked to give his fingerprints, he made an off-the-record comment, if you like, to the officers doing it, saying, "It's pointless you doing this. You know that I always wore gloves."
A sample had been taken when he'd been arrested, which is pretty standard. That was then couriered by officers by hand to the Forensic Science Service. They opened up their lab, and by 4 p.m. that afternoon, it was confirmed that it was him, and he was a Night Stalker.
Delroy Grant was 53 years old. He lived in Brockley Mews in southeast London with his second wife, who suffered from degenerative and progressive multiple sclerosis.
After Grant was charged, I became the family liaison officer, which is an unusual thing to happen. But in this case, the family really were victims of his as well, because they were innocent people who all of a sudden had their world turned upside down by what had happened. It was obvious the police were searching the house, and it didn't take long for the local community to realise who had been arrested and where he lived. So their lives were made incredibly difficult by what had happened. Despite the DNA hit, they still couldn't believe that their father was the Night Stalker.
He was a good father, he enjoyed cricket, people spoke of him well. No one really had anything bad to say of him.
He's such a nice guy, but I just can't, it's a shock. It's unbelievable.
You know, totally devoted to his wife and children, and as I said, it's just come to a shock in this small, tight-knit community.
He was registered as someone that was a carer for his wife, Jennifer. Of course, the only footnote perhaps to add to it is that the car he was driving, the car he was allotted on the Motability scheme for driving Jennifer around, was also the car he was driving out to the scenes of his attacks.
So it really was like he was living this kind of double life. And in the early days of his incarceration at the police station, there was an officer taking him some food into his cell. He said to her, I've got a thing about this DNA, really. He said, you need to be really careful. I don't want to drop anyone in it, but you do want to check my son's DNA, because I understand it could be quite close to mine, and I think it's quite likely that he's committed these offences, not me, so you need to have a look at my son. At that point, trying to throw the suspicion off himself, which is breathtaking, really. The question that everybody wanted answered after he was arrested was he in the system? And what they meant by that was, did we have a file on our database relating to Delroy Grant? And the answer to that is yes. At the start of his spree in the summer of 1999, he committed a burglary in Bromley. The local neighbourhood watch coordinator had seen a BMW car acting suspiciously at the time of a burglary, and he'd taken the number of that BMW.
He saw a man get out of the car, put a balaclava on, put a set of gloves on, and go towards his neighbour's address. What happened, that was investigated by Bromley Borough. The Bromley Borough officer did some cursory police national computer checks and found 2 Delroy Grants that she thought were likely to be the suspect. One had an address in Leicester, one had an address in Dulwich.
Not unreasonably, she assumed that the Dulwich one would be the one she was looking for because it was South East London. That man, that Delroy Grant, was the wrong one. The one who lived at Brockley Mews had formerly lived in Leicester. That was our Delroy Grant, the one we arrested, the one that was in the cells. Where it was crucial to Operation Minstead was that the wrong Delroy Grant had had his DNA taken when arrested for other offences and was on the database. So when they asked for the DNA from the Minstead crime scene to be compared to Delroy Grant's DNA, they compare it to the wrong one, the wrong DNA, there's no match. And from that point onwards, Delroy Grant of Brockley Mews is on the Minstead computer as eliminated by DNA. And what's also just a salutary lesson as to how these things should be checked, in 2001, somebody did phone the incident room and say, I've seen all your publicity about Minstead, and I think Delroy Grant of Brockley Mews could be your man. I think he might have done it. The first thing they do is they go to the database, eliminated by DNA. Even if they had swabbed all the 20,000 people on their list, he wasn't one of them. So that mistake, that assumption and lack of checking by that one officer poisoned it forevermore, and Delroy Grant had another 10 years of liberty, and dozens more old people were victimised while he was free. He pleaded not guilty and ran what can only be described as the most incredible defence I think I've ever heard. Essentially, he said that his first wife in 1979, when they were splitting up, had saved semen from when they'd had sex, when she had employed a third person to deposit it around the crime scenes. It was just a fantasy defence of the very first order. It was just completely incredible.
Thanks to Tim and Kay. We'll just break in. We've got some news coming in from Woolwich Crown Court. This is where the trial of Delroy Grant, accused of being the notorious Night Stalker, is taking place. Delroy Grant, the man accused of being the Night Stalker, has been found guilty of 29 counts of preying on 18 elderly men and women between 1992 and 2009. They said that he was responsible for some of the most awful and disturbing crimes in the history of Scotland Yard. So that's a line just coming into us there, that the police are apologising for missed chances to stop Delroy Grant.
The judge said that he would have to serve 27 years before he was eligible to apply for parole from his life sentence. And that means that the absolute youngest that Delroy Grant could be before he's released back into the world would be 81 years old. And were that to happen, I guess we have to think that he would be, he'll be posing little threat by that time. The number of offences that we had by the time I left are that he was involved in 204, many of which included indecent assaults and 5 of which included rapes.
He was a sexual predator who just committed the most barbaric crimes with meticulous planning, some of which we probably don't know about.
It may well be that a lot of his victims suffered at his hands, but suffered in silence and never actually reported them, but carried it with them to their graves.
Most are deceased now, unfortunately. I hope that the families don't think about him and they can get a very small iota of satisfaction in the fact that he is no longer doing the same things to other people that happen to their families.
We went through an exercise with the family liaison officers of phoning and telling the victims that somebody had been arrested. And one of the victims said that back to her. She said, "That's great, I can go back to sleeping at night now."
I think he thought that he was invincible. I think he thought he'd never get caught.
He was arrested on the 17th day of the surveillance operation. So he had 17 years on the one hand, 17 days on the other.
It was only Colin's fresh impetus which led to Delroy Grant being caught.
I always knew that I wanted to go to get in front of him. I believed from really early on that we needed to ignore the DNA. We needed to catch a burglar. Everybody kept telling me we're not a burglary squad. They needed to be a burglary squad. That's when we got him.